Welcome to our fifth keynote lecture in this conference of the European Academy of Religion here in Münster, Germany. We have tackled the overall theme of the conference on religion and change now in 4 keynote lectures and till now in 2 central discussions. One more will follow this afternoon. And we had listened to various considerations about the topic of change related to religion. And I welcome now today very much Azza Karam from far away. I don't know where she is, but I welcome you and greet you, and I'm happy that you are here. Professor Dr. Azza Karam was born in Egypt and is now Secretary General of Religions for Peace International, an international organization devoted to what the title says of this organization, Religions for Peace. And she's also Professor of Religion and Development at the EuARe2021 in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Previously, she served as a senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund, was coordinator or chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, senior policy research advisor at the United Nations Developmental Programme in the Regional Bureau for Arab States, and president of the Committee of Religious NGOs at the United Nations. She is the lead facilitator for the United Nations Strategic Learning Exchanges on Religion, Development and Diplomacy, building on a legacy for serving as a trainer cum facilitator of intercultural leadership and management in the Arab region as well as Europe and Central Asia. And as you heard now so often the word United Nations, you can see that she is a global actor in the area, in the field of religions. And as far as I can see, and I was told from others who already met you at other occasions, you are an expert on the global situations of the religions in relation to each other, but as well also a specific expert on the variety and the trends and schools within the Muslim world especially. So from her publications, I like to mention a book which she has edited with the title Transnational Political Islam, Religion, Ideology and Power, which she edited now some years ago, 2004, and in which she wants to hint to the diversity of Islamist thinking and practice in Western countries, but as well explores their transnational connections in both East and West. And we had a special discussion forum on Islam in modern Europe, where we also talked a lot about on political Islam, as one of the disputants, Professor Schröder from Frankfurt, has also written a well-received book on political Islam in Germany. Earlier, she has published books on women, Islamism and the state, and women in parliament beyond numbers. In 2016, she published Realizing the Faith Divided, Religion, Gender, Peace and Security. And in 2015, she edited a book on religion and development. In 2012, she published a book on religion, development and the United Nations. Again, 2 keywords which I already mentioned in introducing your career. Today, she speaks now on complementing the divine, the multi-religious as the poetics of resilience. And we are looking very much forward to your contribution. But before you can start, I have to say one more technical thing. After your lecture, there will be the possibility to ask questions here in Münster from those who are here, and also from the online participants who can send their questions with the chat in the online performance, and I will receive it on a tablet here, and then I can read it if there are questions coming. So now I invite you to give you a presentation, and welcome in this, say, virtual way of coexistence and co-presence. Thank you very much that you are here. Now it's up to you, please.
Thank you. So it's a great honor and privilege to be with you here today. Just one very small but very important correction to the title of one of the publications. It was, in fact, realizing the faith dividend as opposed to the faith divided. In other words, realizing what good could potentially come and does come from faith, having it, leveraging it, and being able to live with it and through it. So thank you very much again for that wonderful introduction. As you mentioned, the title of what I wish to speak with you all today is Complementing the Divine, the Multi-Religious as the Poetics of Resilience. And let me say outright, first of all, that I sincerely hope to have as many questions as possible. And so I will be deliberately trying to provoke in the context of my presentation. So thank you for bearing with me while I do this. This is not a very academic lecture. I will do my best to make it sound between serious and very heartfelt. So let me start by a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, where he says, 3 things are necessary for the salvation of man: to know what he ought to believe, to know what he ought to desire, and to know what he ought to do. I will also, given the context, quote from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who says, "Man is made by his belief. As he believes, so he is." Now let's just put aside the gender of the language for a second. This is speaking to all of humankind. One of the basic principles of the Charter of the United Nations, an institution I served for nearly 2 decades, and I very strongly believe in, one of the basic principles of the Charter of the United Nations is that of the dignity and equality inherent in all human beings. All members of the United Nations governments have pledged themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization to promote and encourage universal respect for and the observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction to anything: race, sex, language, religion, ethnicity, nothing. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenants on Human Rights proclaim the principles of non-discrimination and equality before the law, and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Furthermore, the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief notes, among other things, that, and I quote, "the disregard and infringement of human rights and fundamental freedoms, in particular of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or whatever belief, have brought, directly or indirectly, wars and great suffering to humankind, especially where they serve as a means of foreign interference in the internal affairs of other states, and amount to kindling hatred between peoples and nations." We're living in very odd times indeed. And I do not just mean COVID times and the climate change that we're all experiencing in every single corner of the world. Both of these already effectively are changing us, slowly but surely, in ways we may yet to appreciate. In the introduction, we heard about how this way of congregating, of meeting, of conversing already has become our new normal. Surely this way of being together and yet really not being together, me not being able to see anybody and yet all of you being able to see me, etc., surely this way will impact on our perception of one another at a minimum. It'll impact on even how we feel about the way that we present, to whom we present, to whom we talk. Am I talking to myself here? Am I talking to others? Even to ask that question in and of itself will have an impact on what I choose to say and how I choose to say it. This, in turn, also relates to how we see ourselves and how we appreciate others or not. And this brings out, in very stark ways, some good things, but also perhaps some not so very good things. I refer to it as the poverty of goodness and the goodness of poverty. Indeed, we live in times of what many describe as a democratic recession, where to utter words of hatred to those who are unlike us, to others, is actually increasingly normalized, and in some cases beyond normalized. It is seen as a good thing to do, to speak ill of the other. And if these forms of democratic recession, indeed the absence of common decency, I would think, if these forms are to be reversed, it will take a very deliberate effort by each and all of us, individuals, communities, institutions. And this, I argue, is very much needed, because we need to expand the shrinking space for dissent and for pluralism, but we must also make sure we do so in a way that the dissent is civil, not warlike. Yet, when it comes to promoting human rights, the foreign policy of most nation states tends to single out specific aspects of faith or belief, if it speaks to it at all. As if when finally we decide to acknowledge religion, especially in the Western Hemisphere, the acknowledgement of religion comes through the lens of religious freedom or freedom of expression. The freedom to speak ill of somebody else's faith. That is freedom of expression too. Religion or belief, for anyone who professes either, is, I believe, one of the fundamental elements in our human conception of life. Should we not, therefore, seek to fully respect freedom of religion or belief, and as people of faith and none, seek to ensure that they can be guaranteed, such that freedom of religion and belief can contribute to the attainment of the goals of world peace, social justice, and friendship among peoples, and contribute to the elimination of ideologies or practices of colonialism and racial discrimination, which are powerfully re-emerging in our midst today. Again, re-emerging, normalized, sometimes laudated. Many foreign policy makers in Europe in particular, but also the United States, are in the process of creating several bodies which are attempting to have a role, play a role, in promoting freedom of religion on the global stage, by shining a light on the persecution of religious minorities and prisoners of conscience, and by aiding efforts to stop the internationalization of blasphemy bans and selective naming and shaming of countries committing violations of religious freedom. This is important, but this is still very much a Western Hemisphere-led effort. In fact, it is a European Union vested effort and a US foreign policy effort. Yet, and this is an important qualification, many scholars as well as peacemakers, development practitioners, including a relatively strengthened movements of resistance to seize the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, many of these people argue that there are limits to what can be accomplished by a narrow focus on religious freedom. The right to worship according to the dictates of one's conscience actually does not automatically ensure political pluralism, civic engagement, or freedom of expression and organization. It limits free expression to the realm of religion, and it can sometimes exclude the focus on those who champion democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, and environmental concerns, amongst others. Meaning that as we increase the focus on religious freedom, we also diminish the focus of the role of faith in motivating, in inspiring, in playing a key leading and instigative role to champion democracy, human rights, and other concerns. If these features that I have just listed, democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, environmental concerns, and among other intersectional dynamics, if these features are not simultaneously also actively struggled for, also actively defended simultaneously, what we may end up doing is ensuring the religious freedom of those close to existing centers of political power. This means that all those who are not close to the political power centers are rendered relatively more vulnerable. In other words, if you happen to be close to the ruling regime or junta or establishment, indeed, that claims that it is arguing for religious freedom and defending religious freedom, then good for you. But if you're not, which is the case of the majority of people, then we are rendered effectively more vulnerable because we are not promoting an intersectional set of experiences, concerns, existential as they are, but we are siloing a human right, slicing part of a human right, and making that the emphasis and our focus. This is a vicious cycle, in fact, because as the political power centers try to aspire to religious freedom, to be seen as the protectors of religious freedom, of some, what that actually means is that there is a majority that is not protected and a number of issues and concerns which are not equally addressed. It is clear, in fact, that in both principle and practice, it is possible actually for authoritarian states to embrace religious freedom, while freedom of expression always constitutes an existential threat to dictators of all sorts. This prompts an important inquiry. As in my role at the moment in Religions for Peace, which is the largest, it is the United Nations of religions, if you will, where the United Nations has governments, Religions for Peace has member religious institutions and representatives of faith communities around the world. All faith communities, all religious institutions are and form the board and the membership of Religions for Peace. So as an institution which brings together all the world's religious institutions and upholds the values common to all faiths, specifically love, compassion, mercy, and what they will entail, what would happen if these very same religious leaders and institutions themselves jointly decide to play together a pivotal role in securing freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief? In other words, imagine what the impact could be when all these religious institutions and faith representatives together agree and actively secure the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. Thought, conscience, religion, and belief. Every religious institution struggling for that. But as a means of trying to answer this question, let's first try to understand what freedom means, at least what I mean by freedom, especially when we speak of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Nelson Mandela noted in his work entitled The Long Walk to Freedom that, I quote, "There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountaintop of our desires." The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said this, I quote, "When we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty. We are free at last. So, rather than explore the entire gamut of what freedom entails to so many and each, allow me to settle for a very quick look here with you on how the notion of freedom is sometimes understood and practiced in terms of sustainable development, or the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise referred to as Agenda 2030. Why do I choose this? Why do I choose to look at freedom through the Sustainable Development Goals? Because whether we realize it or not, that Sustainable Development Goals were actually arrived at and signed onto by 193 governments, the members of the United Nations. For those of you who know the challenges of international human rights and international humanitarian law, for those of you very familiar with the challenges of having even one government agree to a policy direction, there is little doubt that you should be able to appreciate what it means to have 193 governments agree to a set of global priorities for human development. It's a very, very huge thing, especially in the context of a very divided, very divisive set of realities around us today. So let's look for a second, and I'm going to be very brief, on freedom as development or development as freedom. And I am going to use, as many of you probably guessed, I'm going to refer to Amartya Sen, an Indian economist who was awarded the 1988 Nobel Prize, 1998 Nobel Peace Prize in Economic Sciences for his contributions to welfare economics and social choice theory, and for his interest in the problems of society's poorest members. Interestingly, Amartya Sen himself quotes an 18th century poet, William Cowper, on freedom. And let me just quickly quote the quote. "Freedom has 1,000 charms to show, that slaves, however contented, never know." Sen explains how in a world of unprecedented increases in overall opulence, millions of people living in rich and poor countries are still unfree. Even if they are not technically slaves, they are denied elementary freedom and remain imprisoned in one way or another by economic poverty, social deprivation, political tyranny, or cultural authoritarianism. Sen was actually talking about the 1990s. Now consider what it is like in a COVID-riddled world, which has already become an excuse for some governments to exercise even more authoritarian controls. A COVID-riddled world which has shown us and shined a very harsh light on the enormous inequalities of access to basics in our society. Do we actually really know how many people are dying as a result of COVID in countries where the reporting is kept deliberately vague, so that governments are not revealing just how much or how little control they have over the spread of the virus? Indeed, we are talking about a tyranny, a political tyranny, economic poverty, social deprivation, and authoritarianism in today's world. The main purpose of development, Sen argued, is to spread freedom and its 1,000 charms to the unfree. The unfree we know to be, in today's figures, the millions who live not only in poverty, not only without access to affordable quality education, decent levels of food, just basic nutrition, sanitation, a safe and secure environment, or even those without access to decent employment opportunities. In fact, the unfree are those whose lives are impacted simultaneously by the intersecting calamities of all of this, plus an environment which is threatening each and every life of this planet. Freedom, as Sen argues, is at once the ultimate goal of social and economic arrangements and the most efficient means of realizing general welfare. It's a means and an end. He spoke of social institutions like markets, political parties, legislatures, the judiciary, and the media as contributing to development by enhancing individual freedom. They themselves, however, are sustained by social values. And he links values, institutions, development, and freedom. Using Sen's understanding then, and juxtaposing that understanding against today's environmental realities, learning from many other developmental economists and scientists, we can say that freedom is the holistic work of ensuring that we have a sustainable environment which comes together with and enables the essentials of a dignified life, a life where access to the basic needs, education, healthcare, employment, is complemented by the absence of all forms of violence. That is a life of dignity. As a side point, this is why it's important for institutions that are pluralistic in nature, such as my organization, Religions for Peace. It's why it's important for us to focus on peace, not as the absence of war, which heaven knows is big enough, but in fact, as the situation where every form of dignified life is enabled at the same time, and where the religions together are not simply talking to the dignity, but in fact helping realize that. The more I think of freedom and faith, the more I find myself thinking of mercy, compassion, love. I choose to focus on the poetics of freedom, therefore, from the prism of those precise values, mercy, love, and compassion, which actually undergird all religions. Where is the link between freedom as mercy? Pope Francis says, a little bit of mercy makes the world less cold and more just. In the Bhagavad Gita, we hear, you are what you believe in. You become that which you believe you can become. So if we believe in mercy, we shall become merciful. And in so doing, make the world less cold and more just. So let's ask a few rhetorical questions. Can we live without experiencing mercy ourselves? A sense of mercy towards ourselves? What about the sense of mercy towards and from one another? What kind of a life is it in which we don't experience that sense of mercy from one another and towards ourselves? If we cannot live without some form of mercy, should we not then understand that within each of our faith traditions, there is actually a call, a demand, an obligation, an imperative to be merciful towards others? But how can we be merciful towards others if we deny them their right to exercise their freedom of religion or belief? How can we claim to be people of some faith if we do not actively struggle for that freedom, not only for ourselves, but mercifully for those freedoms for each and every fellow human being? As the Bhagavad Gita again enlightens, there is mercy in showing mercy. So it is merciful to demand that as I claim the freedom to believe in the divine, in whatever form I believe that divine takes, I will actively affirm your freedom to believe and to exercise that belief. Now let me look at freedom as love of the divine, love of one and all. There's an African proverb which says, tell me who you love and I will tell you who you are. A Turkish Muslim scholar, Dr. Adnan Oktar, elaborates on one of the verses of the Quran in which he says that it is explicitly stated that God notes the existence of people from different faith and opinions as his creation and something that we have to acknowledge and welcome lovingly, because this is the divine, a creation of the divine and a predestined humankind. I will not quote the surah, but it is Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, verse 84. And it basically says, in the translation from Yusuf Ali, to thee we sent the scripture in truth, confirming the scripture that came before it and guarding it in safety. So judge between people by what God hath revealed. Follow not vain desires, diverging from the truth that you can see that has come to thee. To each among you we have prescribed a law and a way. to each among you we have prescribed a law and a way. If God had so willed, he would have made you all a single people. But he has given you choice, so strive in virtue. Make a race to be more virtuous. The goal of you is ultimately to return to the divine. So those among you, he among you, who shows the truth in matters is the divine. Muslims, in fact, are called upon to have an inner love and compassion for people of all faiths, races, and nations, because they are supposed to consider them the manifestations of God in this world and treat them with heartfelt respect and love. This is echoed in every single faith tradition. Of course, we can search to find out the mean, nasty, horrid things, or we can dwell on that which is calling for love. Let's move away from scripture for a second, and let's look at Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian novelist, poet, professor, and critic. I quote him when he says, "We cannot trample upon the humanity of others without devaluing our own." The Igbo, always practical, put it concretely in their proverb, "He who will hold another down in the mud must stay in the mud to keep him down." But the thing is, we cannot stay in the mud. As people of faith, whatever, we are called upon, in the words of Saint Teresa of Avila, not only to love the divine, but to accustom ourselves to continually make many acts of love, for they kindle and melt the soul. But how do we love the divine? There is also an answer for me in the Talmud, that whosoever does not persecute them that persecute him, whosoever takes an offense in silence, he who does good because of love, he who is cheerful under his sufferings, these are friends of God, and of them the scriptures say, they shall shine forth like the sun at noontide. So, scriptures, poetry, sayings. Here's a very humble reflection. The freedom to love the divine, as reflected in each and every living thing, not just humans. This freedom is not a choice that we make. It is an obsession we must have. But the love of the divine is tempered by freedom. The freedom to see the reflection of the divine in each and every human being and living thing, including those who may not even believe in the divine. Freedom is also compassion. In the Kopan monastery in Nepal, Kyabye Lama Zopa Rinpoche, speaking in the 33rd Kopan course, says, I quote, "If our mind is devoid of compassion, if our heart is devoid of compassion, inner peace and contentment, then no matter what extensive things or external practices we perform is not real. It's not spiritual. Our heart is empty of spiritual practice." I repeat, in my words, without compassion, our heart is empty of spiritual practice. So, an outlook that is encapsulated by a poet, a novelist, a singer, a memoirist, Maya Angelou, who passed away in 2019. Her quote was, "My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." Here we come to paying God a compliment. Saint Teresa of Avila said, "You pay God a compliment by asking great things of him." This is the vision of service in Religions for Peace. We aim to pay God one compliment after another, making one great ask after another. We ask God to help us realize the freedoms of all religions, to make that peace, to enable the realization with a humility based on an obsession with love, with mercy, with compassion. an obsession with the divine in all its manifestations and forms. I want to quote the Buddha where he says, "However many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do if you do not act upon them?" And this brings me to resilience. The meanings of resilience, rooted in psychology, ecology, the study of social ecological systems, effectively is, and I'm trying to cobble together from all these different disciplines, the focus on change in complex systems, interactions that take place. So resilience almost as a way to describe how any system, human or otherwise, handles change. Of course, the definitions differ in what kind of system is being described as resilient, and whether even to define resilient as a desirable thing. But let's try to see resilience as connectivity to systems or communities. Resilience is rooted in and within complex interactions. It is about movement, change, transformation. So resilience, therefore, is not necessarily about surviving as an individual, although of course it can include that. But in a world linked by COVID, where one person still suffering can endanger everyone, we are required to be resilient by handling the collective we faced with the multiple challenges. So to many, faith is where the possibility of resilience comes from, not only because of what we believe individually, but because of what our faith teaches us about both understanding and living freedom as connecting and connected to one another. I like to think that the freedom we viewed in the context of mercy, compassion, and love is both the means to and the end of resilience. So what does all this mean? And here I quote my favorite poet and author, Khalil Gibran. From the Prophet, he writes, "You give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give." An existence in which we have focused on our individual selves, our own institutions, our own nation-state boundaries, an existence in which we have given only to our immediate community, family, whatever, is an existence in which effectively we have asked very little indeed of God, actually. It doesn't sound to me like that would be the exercise of compassion or mercy of love. In fact, such an existence in which we focus on the immediate or our own, that which is like us, that kind of an existence limits our freedom and actually may well curb our resilience. All of us, even if all of us were vaccinated in any given country, we're still by no means safe. COVID has gone nowhere. It's still there. Therefore, confronted with COVID and its myriad impacts, Religions for Peace had to try to look at the world of faiths. We learned from over 50 years of convening religious communities to work together that our faiths together were the means of building the interconnected web which would enable the resilience of our humanity and our planet. We learned that to focus on or with any one religion or religious community only is actually to unravel the connectivity, which the virus itself was showing us. The virus does not distinguish between anyone or limit itself to any one nation, ethnicity, religion, social status, gender, or any boundary. Rather, the virus and its impacts are breaking through our walls of othering and disconnecting us further. The virus is a negative loop in our lives. The positive loop is to build the resilience, to realize our freedom as mercy, compassion, and love, to serve all faiths as an act of one's own faith. It is to secure the web of human and planetary connectivity. So therefore, the multi-religious and multi-faith is the means to resilience. And resilience faced and built together is the means to build a multi-religious, multi-faith web of connectivity. In other words, asking God to help us realize that cohesion, especially in these times, is paying God a compliment, because it is asking great things of God. But we ask great things of God as we ask great things of one another, as we serve one another, regardless of our differences, because we will never be safe within the parameters and boundaries that we think we have. If COVID and climate change has shown us anything, it has shown us that in order for us to survive and to thrive, we are absolutely compelled to look after one another. It isn't a choice, it's an imperative. That is why Religions for Peace, the organization I'm privileged to serve, set up within the first 2 weeks in March, after the lockdown, global lockdowns were starting. We set up the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund. Why? It wasn't because religious organizations are not already working at warp speed, delivering 1,100%. In fact, every single religious community is working nonstop, because we know that religious organizations actually are at the forefront of humanitarian efforts. They're the first responders in most places around the world, whether that humanitarian crisis happens to be human-made or whether it happens to be natural disaster. Religious institutions are out there serving all the time. It isn't because that this is not happening, it is happening. But what we noticed immediately was that every single religious institution, every single religious first responders was responding to their own community, their own institution, through their own means for everybody, but primarily their own constituencies, their own organization. So as the religious world is serving, it actually still is serving its own. And Religions for Peace wanted to try to continue that cycle of freedom, that requires, demands mercy, compassion towards others, but through giving. So we created a fund that is meant to support those, doesn't matter how big, how small, in different parts of the world, who are all responding to the same needs. They're all responding to the crisis of COVID and what it is impacting on their societies, but they are determined to work together. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever the religious composition in any place, they're actually making a difference by working together. They're determined to serve together. And this is paying God a huge compliment, because it is in the determination to give, not of our resources, but of ourself to the other, and to do so in serving the other, regardless of who that other is. That is what we're trying to build as resilience. If we succeed in enabling religious communities of whatever type to be working together in this moment of extended crisis, then we are succeeding in building a framework of social cohesion. But if each religious institution continues to go it alone, no matter how many they serve, no matter even how many countries they serve, we will still be talking about siloed forms of existence. We need them for sure. But can we genuinely afford not to work together to build that mutual resilience that the virus and everything else around us is telling us is what we absolutely need? Because the survival of one depends on the survival of all, depends on the survival of one. So therefore, we are at that moment in time where we have to make a choice, not to be faithful only, not to decide to give to our own community, but to decide to actively work together to give and share of the resources that we have to serve one another. That is the ultimate test of whether we have actually imbibed freedom for one and all, whether we have actually delivered on the basic tenets of our faith, whether we are actually building a resilience or simply coping for the time being, and whether we are going to build social cohesion or live fractured for the rest of the time that we have on this earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karam, for these reflections and your presentation, which includes a lot of inspiration, especially, I mean, in your last part, you have been very enthusiastically presenting your ideas concerning our religious existence and about the religious communities. But there have been also some challenges, I had the feeling, especially to this audience of the European Academy of Religion. So a bit at the first part, some challenging points concerning, say, Europeans. I don't mind about the North Americans. In a sense, you contributed, I have now the understanding, to our overall topic of religion and change in the way that you described how religions and religious faith communities can contribute to the change, to change the world. So it's not, say, changing the religions, rather it's the other way that, say, the effects of religion on necessary changes in the world, and you explained this with, in the end, with the topic of resilience, so that faith communities together can strengthen the resilience of people against the many, many plagues which we experience and the negative elements in our lives everywhere. So perhaps I want to mention also in a short summary that then we perhaps could lead to a first question from myself to you, that you in a sense have been giving actually also a European presentation, because you were in a sense playing, say, an abstract concept of freedom on the one hand, and on the other hand, the old West, the old values of the West, compassion, mercy, and love of the neighbor against this. So in a kind, trying to find a balance between, I would say now, the values of the French Revolution, which are now everywhere in all European societies, the main core values of societies: freedom, equality, and solidarity. You were playing a bit this against, or the others, the old values of the Christian West: mercy, compassion, and love of neighbor, against these more abstract values of the French Revolution, which are now everywhere. In the papers of the German parties, for example, you find always the reference to these values of the French Revolution. So I had the feeling you presented a bit of an old European discourse, how much of the Christian West, in the sense of its values, survived and has to survive in our modern world. So perhaps I'm wrong, I'm not sure if I misunderstood you in that sense. Perhaps you may comment on my comments.
Sure, thank you very much. I would just say that I think it's actually quite impressive and rather remarkable that you would think that compassion, love, and mercy are Western values, or that they are Christian values. They absolutely are not limited. And I quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, I quoted from the Talmud, I quoted from the Quran, I quoted from almost every single faith tradition, indigenous proverbs from Africa. So I'm so sorry, but I really don't think that you can claim that compassion, love, and mercy are Christian Western values. In fact, I think they came to the West from a heritage that Western civilization itself has been built on, which is the heritage of the rest of the world. So yes, I am very much speaking about compassion, love, and mercy, not as Western values. I am reclaiming them as the values of all faiths. Faiths that are far older than Western civilization as we know it today, and faiths that are global, from the indigenous peoples to the very large institutions that we see today.
I didn't want to claim that this is only Western or European values. I only want to hint to the fact that the Christian West without considering the rest, had exactly these values, these three values. And there are many writings on this, and the problems in combination, it raises in the combination, let's say, with these values coming from the French Revolution to us. So
they are common.
I didn't want to claim that they're not also there in other religions, but it's a certain type of discourse. And as I was a friend with Hans Küng, I mean, I know that everywhere we have certain basic values which are common in all religions. And in a sense, I would also say it's still a bit of in this tradition, which you argued, perhaps. Yeah, but perhaps there are questions from you. I don't want to make a dialogue with you only. You, please.
Question. You said that the society gets more resilient if they are multi-religious approach. So I would have a personal question to yourself. Do you see yourself as a multi-belonger or dual belonger to multiply religions? Or how do you would say, what do you self-believe?
Great, thank you for that question. I would say, to be honest, that my argument isn't that it's only in the existence of different multi-religious. So multi-religious existence is certainly very fine, but what we do predicated upon that multi-religious or that pluralism is what makes a difference, is what helps build the resilience. So just having individual different religions in any given context, and each of these religions really being focused on themselves, their own community, their own values, that's actually not building a resilience that has to involve everyone, but it's working together, serving together, and serving one another, regardless of our religious or ethnic or gender, whatever differences. That is ultimately the freedom, that building on compassion, love, and mercy towards one another. That is what makes a difference. That is what causes or enables, if you will, the transformational type of society that is a resilient one, that can bounce back, that can lead to coping, not only coping, but in Maya Angelou's words, thriving. Your question is about myself. I have benefited enormously from being able not only to live and to be brought up for a few years in my own country, which is Egypt, as a Muslim, but also to be able to learn how it is to live together and work together and serve regardless of the different religious differences, but in fact seeing the diversity of the religious, cultural, social fabric, as I did, for instance, in the Netherlands and elsewhere. I learned that the diversity existing on its own is important but insufficient. That making that diversity work through serving one another, regardless of our particular religious or cultural heritage, but being devoted, indeed committed to serving one another, to serving even outside of our comfort zone, spheres of influence, but to serving together. And this is the lesson from Religions for Peace. I learned that that is what makes me a little bit stronger. Many people will tell you, and it's actually quite true, that interfaith dialogue strengthens one's own faith. I recall very vividly when I was speaking to someone from another faith tradition. And I said, there's so much that I can understand and that appeals to me in your faith tradition. I won't mention which one it is. So that if, God forbid, I was ever in a situation where I had to say which religion I would want to be other than mine, I would perhaps choose yours because it speaks to me on so many levels. And the response I got from this person was, oh, that's nice. Well, if I ever had to be in that position, I would still choose my own faith. And I remember thinking, we are defined not only by what we think we have inside ourselves, but we are defined by how we see and in some ways even claim the others, the faith of the others. So yes, the diversity that I have had the privilege to live in has indeed strengthened as it has weakened. But I would say that yes, I have learned more, not only by existing in multicultural contexts, but by serving alongside sisters and brothers and others from different contexts, serving all, not being exclusively focused on only Muslims or only Arabs or only whatever, but actually by serving. And that was enabled through the commitment to a human rights space that doesn't distinguish and does not allow for the distinction, not only between peoples, but doesn't allow for the distinction between different rights. You can't tell me that freedom of thought, conscience, and belief is not intimately connected to every single other human right, because I won't be able to realize that without the others, nor will I realize any of the other rights without this one. So it's that intersectional reality, the connectivity between rights that is also demanding us to be connected as human beings in this context. And every single faith tradition actually calls for that connectivity. But it isn't the verbal to speak. That's also very good, by the way. But it's not enough. It is about working together, serving one another. That is the context that we're speaking about. And that is how I find the strength inside me, but also the strength in the organization that I serve. Sorry, long answer.
No problem. That's no problem. As long as you have to say something, this is great. More questions? I have some written down on my paper during your talk, so I beg your pardon that I more or less try to challenge you a bit.
Go for it.
And you allowed this at the beginning. You asked for the critical questions. So I felt one of the challenges you had in the beginning of the first part of your lecture was that you had some critique to the northern way of promoting religious freedom all over the world, in forcing society, say, into freedom, to giving freedom of religious minorities, but overlooking at the same time the constructive roles of faith communities in the countries, in these societies. And surely we have a direct example now of a disaster from a Western point of view in Afghanistan, where there was perhaps no sensitivity and an abstract way of pressing religious freedom in the countries. But on the other hand, you also criticized, or I heard the critique, that when you said that being merciful to others without giving freedom of religion to others is not possible. So this, I heard a bit of a critique, say, for example, to European practices, because in Europe, in most countries of Europe, it's not also, there's a constructive role of faith communities, of big institutions, but on the other hand, there is full religious freedom of almost all minorities. In my country, you could only say perhaps Scientology church is not acknowledged as a religion, but all others can practice with the law, according to the law, with the guarantees of the law, their freedom as individuals, but also as institutions. So in a sense now, perhaps I misunderstood you. Perhaps my first part would be if I have understood you right in this.
No, I think thank you very much for that. What I would say is that you are right that I am critical of the manner in which religious freedom has become the focus of a significant amount of European, some parts, I shouldn't say significant, but religious freedom has become an important element of European foreign policy, which in and of itself is very fine. The critique I have is that you cannot look at freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, which is the way that is articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 talks about the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. Somehow, thought, conscience, and belief became synergized into religious freedom. All right? Now, thought and conscience are actually not the same as belief. We may have a belief that is institutional, but our thought, the freedom of thought, actually far extends beyond the religion or the religious. Our freedom of thought and our freedom of conscience is our very freedom to exist, to believe. So trying to narrow it down to religious freedom and then making that into a political process which demands accountability from certain countries, and usually from pretty authoritarian regimes, and blinks or turns a blind eye to the authoritarianism of the regime because they claim they're okay on their language on religious freedom. They're okay on their language on religious freedom, but they're actually not okay in the way that they are killing the conscience of citizens in many instances through utterly disregarding their other human rights. The freedom of thought and conscience far outweighs religious freedom. It is inclusive, but it is not the same as religious freedom. You spoke about how the European space is indeed a space that can boast legitimately of the freedom of expressions and the respect for all human rights. But I'll challenge you a little bit and say the European Court of Human Rights just banned women from wearing a veil, Muslim women from wearing the veil in certain contexts. And my question to you would be, wait a minute, why? If we are to uphold the freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, and struggle for the so-called minorities, religious minorities over there in that part of the world, are we not looking at the religious minorities right here, right next to me? And if my own European Court of Human Rights determines that I cannot wear this in certain circumstances, is that respecting my freedom of thought, conscience, and belief? Indeed, is it? It doesn't feel like it. So where are we really on that process of religious freedom that we claim we are in? Is it a foreign policy tactic? Ergo the fact that it's really mostly European and North Americans governments who have even ambassadors of religious freedom. But the rest of the world, which is actually far bigger, hasn't yet cottoned on to that, apparently. So no, yes, I am being critical. I'm being critical of two things. I'm being critical that we have essentialized freedom of thought, conscience, and belief to become religious freedom. And I'm critical of the fact that when this happens, effectively what is being done is that this has been co-opted as a policy, and a foreign policy means that we need to review very, very critically, unless and until freedom of thought, conscience, and belief is as actively struggled for, as actively endorsed as any other human right, as any other right of this planet to exist free of our pollution and our manipulation. Until and unless that happens, we are actually simply siloing a small piece of freedom. We are not struggling to ensure freedom in its holistic sense through compassion, mercy, and love. We are not. We are utilitarian, not faithful.
Yeah, I can follow you, and also in the distinction of this three human rights, conscience, to differentiate and belief. Perhaps for correctness in respect to my country, I don't know all situations in Europe, this applies only to certain positions as civil servants where people have to represent the state against the population. So for example, to be a judge, how you look like would not be a problem, but if the accused person does not see your face, then this would not be possible, according to German understandings. But now I have a question from online participant, Dr. Sung Kim. Thank you for your beautiful, heartfelt, and insightful paper. I was fascinated by your idea how to relate the Sustainable Development Goals, and I believe it works pretty well in this field of common goals. question: how can situations be addressed that would be regarded as human rights violations in, for example, Germany, without denouncing specific national interests and culturally embedded interpretations, for example, in China? In Europe, people would refer to Western values to avoid universalist notions because they sound cultural superiorist. Do you have any better ideas than that to get into a critical and respectful discussion?
This is a brilliant question. Thank you very much. How long have I got? It would take quite a while, I think. And this is indeed an endeavor of a lifetime, to be honest. And I think this is where I'm trying to suggest that when religious actors, institutions, leaders, communities work together and evolve that common discourse that is rooted from and based on so many different faith traditions, but the commonality. I'm trying to argue that that conversation, that discourse that comes and is articulated by religious actors together, so not just any one religious actor, much as we may love what they have to say. Let's think of His Holiness Pope Francis. He speaks wonderful things. He does wonderful things. He's still the Pope, the Catholic Pope. Now imagine if all the other faith leaders and religious institutions were to come together to speak so powerfully together. This is what Religions for Peace has been enabling over time. But it creates a fundamentally different kind of discourse, which is necessary, but again, in and of itself, insufficient. In other words, we have the language of human rights. We have the language of diplomacy that is supposed to be that which can be our common protective space and nurture us as we coexist. But the truth of the matter is that we still create remarkable amounts of diversity and distinctions and disruptions because we insist on one way or one manner or one discourse only. And the truth of the matter is that when you merge the traditional diplomatic rhetoric and its institutions with a multi-religious rhetoric and institutions and service, which is what COVID and the climate are calling us to do, is like, you don't really have the chance to just sit down and bemoan situations. You need to work, actively work, change your own lifestyle and change others' lifestyle in order to safeguard this planet and in order to be healthier. Now, if we think about that combination of the traditional secular diplomatic narrative informed by and informing a multi-religious narrative of love, compassion, and mercy, then we are talking about other possibilities of articulating a common interest that isn't rooted in one nation only, that isn't rooted in any national boundary, in any ethnic boundary, in any gender boundary. It is in fact that discourse of the whole human being. But just even to have those kinds of mutually reinforcing conversations between traditional secular speak and multi-religious, merciful speak and action, I think therein lies a very, very critical way of being able to transform, to address issues of deep, deep pain, tension, concern, insecurity, but to do so from a vantage point of actually believing in the sanctity of the human being in front of you and in what this human being believes in, rather than requiring that human being to conform to your principles, your position, your way of thinking. It is an enforced, that conversation between traditional secular diplomacy and multi-religious diplomacy, which, by the way, is the oldest form of diplomacy known to humankind, because we recall that the empires of old, especially, but not only in Europe and elsewhere, were actually religiously based empires. So it's actually the oldest form of diplomacy out there. But that merging of those discourses of diplomacy, the multinational and the multi-religious, that is where humility has to become a sine qua non. And I think it somehow levels the playing field. And I think therein is a potential to transcend the fears, which are part and parcel of the way that we communicate with one another today and have been doing so for many a generation. It's a fear, it's an insecurity-based discourse. We call it diplomacy. But in fact, if diplomacy were to be the business of the multi-religious and the multinational, working alongside to serve all, barring none, that in and of itself would be a transformative dynamic in discourse and praxis, which would result in the kind of resilience that we all desperately need. In other words, get together as religious actors and religious leaders and transform the nature of the conversation that our traditional diplomats are having today. That might result in ultimately a change to the very basic power dynamics that have existed since colonial era and continue to exist till today. We've always used certain religions, we continue today to use, and the professor here mentioned Afghanistan, we use certain religious discourse to validate politics, more and more, by the way, more and more. Now, I'm not saying that that's good or bad thing. I personally do not believe that that's a good thing. But to ignore religion altogether is an equally unwise thing. To only focus through the prism of one religion is an equally unwise thing. To work together to fashion the discourse that is multi-religious and service-oriented in nature, that's a very different dynamic. It's a very different way of thinking, and it's a very different way of existing. That way, we haven't yet fully grasped or understood. And some of our religious institutions and some of our political institutions resist that way. Because remember, religion is supposed to be a bad, harmful thing, per the secular elite, political establishments. That's because they're thinking of the one religion. Wherever one religion dominates historically, it's actually not been a very good thing. History is replete with proof. But when that conversation, that discourse is not about one religion dominating, but about a level playing field between all faiths and their institutions and the secular institutions, that form of discourse we have yet to see. And that's why Religions for Peace is working with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs this year for the third time to convene a consultation between religious leaders and political leaders on faith and diplomacy. And it's the third in a series of consultations because we are trying to re-envision diplomacy itself and re-enact a different form of faithful conversations that don't have to be rooted in one religion, but in fact are rooted in the common values to all. So I think that is a way we need to go forward, not by saying religion doesn't matter at all, or religion is all harmful, or this religion is good and that religion is bad, or trying to think and see the world from the prism of one religion, any one religion, but in fact by trying to understand what it is that the multi-religious can evoke and convoke and help us realize. That is a different route we haven't tried ever, and it's high time we do.
You are in the light now, and which reflects that. No, it's fine. No, don't move it. Don't move it. I only wanted to say this reflects the fact that it's early in the morning, perhaps, and we welcome also your cat, which in the background.
Yes.
So welcome to her. Now there is a compliment. Not a compliment to the divine, as you recommended to us, but a compliment to you from Jessica Giles from the Open University. Thank you. What a brilliant presentation, such hope and such insight.
Thank you.
I'm not so nice, therefore it was a brilliant presentation. I didn't want, I agree fully with this compliment, but I nevertheless, we have to, for the discussion in this academic surroundings. I have done many activities in the area, say with religious actors in developmental work all over the world, also interfaith and so on. But a main problem is that in many countries of the world, as you said, they speak about religious freedom, but it has no significance. And in my observation and studies, in many constitutions of states of the world, they have a beginning, and that's rather prosaic. That's not a legal text, it's rather an outlook. Or it would be nice if this could, rather like a religious text. So eschatological outlook, or it would be great religious freedom and so on. And now, so as you are strong related to the United Nations, I would like to ask you what can be done to change this situation so that this, say, human rights become basic rights in the legal systems of the country, so that really people can go to court and know that they are listened to with their concerns. So this I think would help many actors in the religious field who are doing developmental work and so on, or human rights works in various states of the world, would really help to have this support by the overall community. This is not another aspect you did not address, I know, because you concentrated on coming cooperation of the religions in, but I want to look on this framework within of the United Nations, because that seems to me the only instrument we have to have a certain influence on many, many countries, unfortunately, too many countries of this type in the world.
So that's a brilliant question. And I think elsewhere I have argued about, because I worked in the UN on and with religion and religious actors. I like to think that the main job I undertook in the UN was to, for lack of a better word, try to open the doors of the UN system, especially headquarters, UN headquarters, to the value of religion in general, the contributions of different religious institutions, religious communities, religious leaders, religious NGOs. So this was my work in the UN for nearly 2 decades. And I can tell you, and I have written about this elsewhere, but I can tell you without a shadow of doubt that the challenges to actually realizing freedom in general, which is the whole of the human rights space, the challenge comes from a very secular culture that the governments themselves feel is necessary to adopt. Because imagine the governments are already arguing with each other about everything under the sun. Imagine if we now add religion to the mix. Imagine what kind of a United Nations we would have. Then it would be nothing. It would be even more problematic and even more of a struggle than it currently is. So there's a need for that secular space. But that secular space, unfortunately, has come at the expense of ignoring the religious dimensions altogether for many, many, many years, right? Which is the Western European secular mindset. And religion you can have it, but keep it private, please. It's not something that we want in our public institutions. Yes? Or if we want it, we dictate very clear parameters to it. Now, that secular way of thinking, while necessary, has actually, I think, gone to the extreme, such that it's taking the United Nations system, it's taken 75 years to begin to appreciate the value of religious communities, religion as faith, religion as embodiment of experience, religion as social service. The original social service providers known to humankind are actually religious institutions, religions as the humanitarian responders. It's taken 75 years to get to that level of awareness. But the second set of challenges, Professor, is that practically speaking, even when certain governments became more comfortable with the idea of religion, they are more comfortable with their own religions. They're not comfortable with other religions, with all religions. So there's been an extension of way of a political hegemonic way of thinking. Okay, yes, I get it. Religions, these organizations are very important because they deliver social services, because they're humanitarian service providers, because they impact on people's thinking, because they can change social norms. Yes, we get it. But then we like the Catholics because we're Catholic. Or we like those Protestant ones, or we like the Orthodox, or we like the Sunni, and I mean, it suddenly became an extension of the own self, as opposed to what I'm trying to argue for, that my organization stands for and has enacted for 50 years. It is that all religions count. They count most when they are together and when they serve together, which has not yet ever happened. I would challenge anyone to mention one particular initiative or project that is actually a contribution by all the faith communities at once, simultaneously. Any program or initiative. It didn't happen. It hasn't been happening. That is why we created the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund, Professor. And now we have 21 projects in 21 countries. A drop for sure in the ocean of humankind and our needs. But nevertheless, that drop is there, where all the faith communities are coming together to serve the needs of all. Because COVID has made us all equals in the face of that crisis. Because a humanitarian climate change has made us all, quite frankly, equal. So the German community suffered in ways that other nations around the world suffered because of the floods. And suddenly it was clear to everybody, it doesn't matter how developed your economy is. It doesn't matter how strong your military is. Climate change hurts all badly. And when that realization sinks in, with it should come the humility to understand that yes, religions matter quintessentially, but it isn't one religion above others. And it isn't about saying, yes, we are all happy and we come and we sing Kumbaya together because we're all of different religions and we, no, it's about that test, the ultimate test of relevance. Am I, in the Buddhist saying, am I prepared just to give you my possession, or am I prepared to give you of myself? And what does it mean? How does that translate into pragmatic everyday reality? It translates in the way that religious actors can come to serve together, to serve together. So I will give you everything I've got, myself, my resources. Take them and let's work together to make them help everybody else. That ultimate test of our humanity, that is the ultimate test and the ultimate process and praxis by which we can change politics. That is why I call it the poetics of resilience. It is the manner in which we experience one another through service, through giving of self, not through saying, well, I'm only going to work on my Muslim communities here, even if I think I'm going to serve every single Sunni Muslim around the world. You know what? It isn't ever going to change anything. It'll be good, great, thank you very much, but it ain't going to change our joint habitat. So what is it going to take? It's going to take that we as religious actors who think so highly of ourselves and our institutions, we actually spend together for the other, for one another. And the day that this can become normal, which is what the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund, that not a single religious community bar one, Rishoku Sekai in Japan, has actually contributed to. None of the other faith traditions think this is worthwhile because they have their own well-functioning, long-standing humanitarian funds and mechanisms. Why should they contribute to another one that's called a Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund? Nobody has time. Nobody has resources. Well, the day that political and religious institutions have the time and resources to contribute together to something called a multi-religious endeavor, that'll be the day that we actually do witness a change in the course of human history and planetary resilience.
Thank you. We have now one more question because we have to close in time. Here will follow a panel or a discussion on the pandemic, religion and governance with contributors from Zimbabwe, Indonesia and South Korea, only for your information that we are discussing this question about say the sharing and the problems and the different ways of managing the pandemic. So please, one more question.
Raman, thank you very much. This is Matthias Eder speaking from the Institute for Interreligious Dialogue and Islamic Studies in Nairobi. Thank you very much for also the connection to the United Nations, but I think you can add a little bit on that Because by focusing on the secular space, the United Nations has kind of lost a large part of the population support in the world, since around 80%, at least 80% of the global population are identifying themselves with one religion. So in that respect, I think it is important to highlight that there are identities in the world, and they are perceived in a specific order by each person individually. And religion has been overlooked as part of that identity complex for quite a long time. So for myself, coming from development work and coming from peace-building work or doing peace-building work still, how would you say can we further highlight these religious identities and further utilize these religious identities to make that work more effective?
Thank you very much, Matthias, and it's great to see you again. So that's exactly what I've been talking about for the last, how long has it been now? Maybe an hour. I am not saying that the secular is a bad thing. I never said that. I am saying that in the context of the United Nations, the secular paradigm is valuable and necessary, because you don't want to have nations also differing about their religious identities. Thank you very much. That's about the last thing the United Nations needs. So the secular becomes a space of common ground, level playing field between the different religions that each of these nation states host or have or would claim with. You don't really want to see a Muslim nation state biting at another Jewish or a Christian. That's just really the last thing you need in the United Nations, quite frankly. So in a way, it is important to have that secular space. What has been to the detriment of our existence, if you will, and the modus operandi that international development and international foreign affairs has happened, is that religion has indeed been seen as an outsider, as an outlier. Even when, as you correctly noted, 80%, at least as per the 2012 Pew research, to 80% of the world claims a certain religious affiliation. So to excise religion from our space of thinking and acting is to shoot ourselves in the foot, put very politely. So the issue then is not how can we further highlight and utilize religion. I beg to differ with you ever so slightly to nuance this point. What has been happening in the last decade, in the last 10 years in the UN, and I testify to this as somebody who has been in the thick of it, what has happened is that religion has become more an interesting feature. It has become, in fact, used. It is being used to further certain objectives. Let's work more with religious NGOs because they are healthcare providers, the bulk of the healthcare providers in some parts of the world. Let's work more with those. Let's give them more money. Let's give more religious NGOs money for the combat of HIV and AIDS, for Ebola, now for COVID. But when you look, what I'm trying to argue against here is that when you look at how that's happening, and I've not actually argued this here, I've argued it elsewhere. When you watch the patterns of how that epiphany of, my goodness, religions matter, so let's do something about it. When you look at how that's actually translated into policies of different governments, especially within the European context, but not only, we realize that there is a use of religion, because now there's an awareness that these people matter and these institutions are very important. But that's not enough. It's not enough to understand and appreciate and give money to all the Christian organizations in the world, which is practically what is happening, or to give money to all the Muslim organizations in the world. That's not the point. That's what's happening. But I'm trying to warn us against that trend effectively of trying to utilize one religion, no matter how grand and diverse its institutions, no matter how old its heritage, no matter how well spoken its leaders. I am trying to argue against the utilization of any one religious discourse. And I argue and I maintain that it is when the religions come together that you have a powerful civic space, because religions hold one another accountable, and because the secular domain holds the religious, the multi-religious domain accountable, and vice versa. The multi-religious holds the secular accountable. To prioritize and to make more important and more valuable one religious institution or one religion is to kill the civic spirit. And that is what many governments are now doing. They're trying to work with certain religious organizations. Unfortunately, they're working with the same religious organizations. Even when all the Christian organizations come together, which hasn't happened, when all Catholic and all Protestant and all Orthodox and everything in between, Christian, come together, guess what? It isn't enough. Guess what? It can actually be divisive, because the world is not Christian. And it will never be only Christian or only Muslim or only Jewish. The whole point is that we are diverse. So yes, by all means, recognize the religious, but recognize the multi-religious. By all means, hold religious institutions accountable, but hold all multi-religious institutions accountable. By all means, have the religious hold the secular institutions accountable, but by all means, even further, make sure that the multi-religious hold the secular accountable, not just one religion. And that is where the change has to happen. That's the difference in what we have today. Religion is important. We all know it. Most governments know it. In my part of the world, they've known it all their lives. They still know it. They still use it. That ain't the point. The point is, are we bringing religious together? Are we seeing the multi-religious? And that way we hold the different religious institutions and leaders accountable to one another, which is actually quite necessary, which is actually very much needed. It's not good enough to go around saying religion is very, very important. We're just making one religion more dominant, which is about the last thing we need. We've lived through histories in which religions, specific religions, were very dominant. It's not a pleasant history to review. It is when the multi-religious is part of the civic and the multinational that we have a different discourse in our entire existence.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have the feeling we could listen to you much longer time, but with the techniques we have to obey a strict time management, because all the online presentations and so on, they have to be organized beforehand, and therefore we have to finish now. Also, I want to tell you one question which also Jessica Charles asks again, but I cannot give you time for an answer, only it's a follow-up question to what you just explained. How do you decide with which religious communities you work together? In brackets, I guess, no radical ones. So this is a follow-up question.
The ones who are prepared to work together, Professor. It's a very simple litmus test. If one religious community is prepared to work with the other, those are the people you work with. That's why Religions for Peace exists. It's about those who are prepared to work together to serve one another, not just a religion that claims the beauty of faith, but the religion that exists to serve other religions in non-religious.
Yeah. Thank you. A short answer, great, because we have to prepare the room now for the next panel. I thank you very much for this inspiring presentations and also for your answers in this in a very vivid discussion which you gave. I think we are all enriched by your presentation and discussion. So thank you very much and greetings to New York.